Wow, this one works. Hey, it is good to see you. Many of you I know already. We have a very, very long and mutually gratifying relationship. A lot of things to talk about today. So let me get right into it. For those few of you who I have not met, I'm Congressman Johnson from Ohio, and I appreciate you attending today's very important caucus meeting, focusing on the status of human rights and transitional justice in Sri Lanka, particularly as it relates to the newly elected Sri Lankan government. As many of you know, I co-chair this caucus with my good friend, Danny Davis from Illinois. He will be here maybe shortly. He's tied up in some important meetings this afternoon that he's trying to juggle around. But we'll get started when he shows up. If he's able to make it, we'll give him an opportunity to weigh in. For those of you, again, that may not be aware, the focus of this caucus is to increase awareness and educate other members of Congress on the protection of rights and identity of all ethnicities and religions in Sri Lanka who are being excluded from society, the economy, and political life through discrimination, harassment, and persecution. Since we started the caucus back in 2013, some progress has been made to increase democratic principles and restore human rights for all Sri Lankans, notably due to the election of the Sri Lanka government in 2015. However, as many of you know, Sri Lanka has a newly elected president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, the brother of former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, who immediately after his election has now appointed Mahinda, his brother, as Prime Minister. So now we got both of the guys in there. Both Gotabaya and Mahinda have been implicated in numerous human rights violations, including war crimes from Sri Lanka's decades-long civil war. You know, although it was slow, we were making some progress. Not what we wanted to make. I mean, it was a constant battle. It seemed like through the State Department and others to keep even the Sri Lanka government that we had so much optimism in on track with the transitional justice and reconciliation reforms that they had promised to make. But we were making some progress in increasing human rights for all Sri Lankans. Regrettably, reports are already surfacing that these gains are now in jeopardy. I read a report earlier this week that the new government under the Rajapaksa brothers has no intentions of following through with the reconciliation efforts that have been identified through the UN Human Rights Council and that they had committed to as a government prior to. So they don't work like we do here in America, where when we make commitments from one administration to the other, we stand up to those commitments because that's the way integrity works. We'll talk about that more. But this is a critical time for the United States and the international community to make sure we are doing everything we can to encourage the Rajapaksa government to uphold Sri Lanka's commitments on reconciliation and accountability. It's vitally important that human rights abuses are not tolerated, and those who commit such atrocities are held accountable. While disheartening, I'm eager to hear this news that I just gave you. I am eager to hear from our panelists today about the status of human rights, in addition to an update on the newly established government and current U.S. relations with Sri Lanka. Since Representative Davis is not here, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. We were going to have three. I'm going to tell you who all three of them are, but one of them had the day off, and I'm sure you would appreciate why. John Sifton from Human Rights Watch had a family emergency, and he's unable to be with us this afternoon. His son had to be picked up from school with the flu, and I'm sure we're glad that he's not coming here if he's got flu bugs around him. I don't know about you, my son just finished his episode of the flu Sunday evening and Monday morning, and didn't go to school on Monday, and he's still tired. It takes a lot out of him. So I wish John the best. But I encourage everyone to take a look at the Human Rights Watch World Report for 2020, which details their concerns that respect for fundamental human rights in Sri Lanka is in serious jeopardy following Gotabaya Rajapaksa's election. This report can be found on their website. But we are fortunate to have Kara Bew speaking on our panel today. Ms. Bew is one of 5 founding partners of Armitage International, a consulting firm that specializes in international business development, strategic planning, and problem solving. Previously, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Regional Stability within the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, and also as a Special Assistant for South Asia to then Deputy Secretary of State Richard Bell Armitage. She also has experience practicing corporate law and has held other positions in government at the Department of Defense and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ms. Bew received her law degree from Loyola University or Loyola Law School, Los Angeles, and is admitted to the bar to practice law in California and D.C. She graduated from Brown University with a dual degree in political science and organizational behavior and management. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. We'll then hear Mario Arulthas, the Advocacy Director for PEARL. PEARL stands for People for Equality and Relief in Sri Lanka, which is a nonprofit led by human rights activists with a mission of ending systemic human rights abuses against the Tamil population in Sri Lanka and promoting equality, rights, and justice on the island. Mario received a Bachelor of Arts in Business Management from the University of Westminster and has served as Editor-in-Chief of the London-based Tamil Guardian. Mario has recently returned from Sri Lanka and has some important insight from his visit to share with us today. Thank you both for being here again today with us. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Bew.
Congressman, thank you for your kind introduction, and I want to thank all of you who are here to listen to us today. Both Mario and I have been in Sri Lanka within the last 6 months. I had visited as part of a joint pre-election assessment mission from our IRI and NDI. And we spent some time there just weeks before the November election, trying to figure out what issues there may be associated with it and any ideas that we might have that could help facilitate free and fair elections in Sri Lanka. So I'll talk a little bit about what we learned there and also how we're viewing, or I'm viewing, U.S.-Sri Lanka relations at this point. And then I'm very interested in what my friend Mario has to say about his visit, particularly his experiences in the north. So just in terms of U.S.-Sri Lanka relations, Sri Lanka fits neatly into the Trump administration's new Indo-Pacific strategy for free and open Indo-Pacific. Sri Lanka sits in what Assistant Secretary Wells is now calling some very valuable real estate. And so more than in the past, Sri Lanka is being considered as part of this strategic effort to engage more fully in the life of the Indo-Pacific region. And so it's taken on some additional value in terms of what U.S. interests are in the region. U.S. Sri Lankan relations after the 2015 elections really got a boost. We had what we believe to be a government that we could work with, one that was committed to some level of reform. As a result, Sri Lanka got a lot of attention from the Obama administration with multiple high-level visits. All of our enthusiasm, however, over time got dimmed a little bit because reform, despite what was agreed to in Geneva, reform efforts and reconciliation efforts weren't moving as quickly as we'd hoped. But as the Congressman said, the progress had started, it just wasn't moving along fast enough, I think, for all of us who cared about transitional justice issues. Recently, however, in 2018 with the constitutional crisis, relations with Sri Lanka got a little more difficult because things weren't obviously going according to plan, and the relationship suffered a bit. There are reports that anti-Americanism, anti-American feelings were rising within Sri Lanka. We began to have more difficulty in terms of getting the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact through. The military is having more trouble with renegotiating the SOFA and AXA agreements, and so things started to turn a little more difficult in our relations. We also had the impending presidential election, and what that might bring. When I was out there in October as part of this assessment mission, it was a very unique situation for Sri Lanka, and that at the time there were many people running for the presidency, but none of the usual suspects. You didn't have the opposition leader, you didn't have the current president, you didn't have the prime minister running for office, and so it was a very unique field. There are questions as to whether somebody could, given the number of candidates, whether somebody could get the majority in the first round, and so we were there to look at all of that. Now, in November, the elections did take place, and by all accounts, they were free and fair, and they were peaceful. So some of the concerns that we had going into it turned out not, to be of naught in that the elections came through. Now, Gotabaya Rajapaksa won by a 52% majority, and he views his situation as having a great mandate from the people of Sri Lanka and has moved forward. For all the reasons that the Congressman pointed out, he may not be an ideal president for U.S.-Sri Lanka relations, but he is the candidate, he is the president that the Sri Lankan people elected. And so for the United States, we have to be able to work with him. Most recently, Assistant Secretary Wells visited Sri Lanka earlier this month. She was there on the 13th and 14th. She met with President Rajapaksa and other members of the government, and she then gave a readout of her visit there, noting the increasing strategic importance of Sri Lanka and the many shared values and interests that we have with Sri Lanka. She was there to deliver a letter from President Trump, which I think very helpfully noted how much value the United States still places on reform and reconciliation. She also mentioned that the president himself commented that he was the president of all Sri Lankans, which we hope to be able to take at his word, but time will tell. Those were some good early signs, but then again, there are also other things that are happening in Sri Lanka, which I think bears noting, and I'm going to stop here and then turn this over to Mario for your take on those issues.
Thank you, Cara, and thank you, Congressman Johnson. I wanted to thank Congress that is here for showing continued interest and giving me the opportunity to speak. Sri Lanka does deserve the attention it is here, and it's important to have continued engagement with Tamils and Tamil Americans. So as Cara mentioned, I was there in November I arrived a few days before the election actually, and many of our friends and colleagues on the ground in the Northeast who are Tamil activists, journalists, politicians were hoping for a victory of the party that ended up losing, the UNP. And this is not necessarily because they thought the UNP was great and progressive and it's going to effect changes, but it was more the Rajapaksas were just fair that much. And I remember sometimes 11 years on since the end of that horrific war, we sometimes forget what horrors the current president and his people actually committed throughout. And so when I was when you're Tamil in the Northeast, those things are still very real. And I think if you look at the election result, it was a very clear mandate for Rajapaksa in the south, where he won the single-list vote overwhelmingly. But in the Tamil area, I think he reached up to 80%. He lost without getting anywhere near close to winning. And it's just in the Northeast, especially if you're a political activist or journalist, it's just so many have lost family, and so many have lost family throughout the war, but also if you're journalists and activists, colleagues and others who were attacked. And not just in the early history of the conflict, but also in the last 15 to 6 years. It was as recent as that. So you can understand why the fear was there. And on election day, I was in Jaffna. I've been advised not to travel outside of Jaffna, but I was walking around, and while shops were closed and the streets were fairly empty, because I think there was some apprehension of something happening, there were long queues at the polling booths. I had not seen such enthusiasm in a long time when I was there. I was there for the local elections 2 years ago, I think. And this was just on a completely different level. And I think seeing the queues, the people themselves were also very positive. Ahead of the election, I think the view was if the minorities, if the Tamil community and the Muslim community come out and vote against Rajapaksa, they wouldn't win. So on the day, I think everyone was very positive and actually, looking forward to the results, and everyone sat looking forward to the TVs to kind of, and then the results started coming. And I think that initial relief that people felt, it just dissipated overnight. So the next morning, I again went on a walk, and again everything was closed, but this time out of fear. All the shops were closed. People were just so afraid that there would be an immediate crackdown. That's how real the fear was. And it's complicated. It's not because the other guy or another government would have made progress on these issues or would have made that much more progress, but it was just that the palpable fear was there with the Rajapaksas, whereas under the previous government, what must be acknowledged is that the democratic space opened up and people like me could return and human rights activists could operate fairly freely. While surveillance and harassment did continue also. And I think, the fear was multiple, right? It was a fear from the military, that the military would overreach as soon as he won, being emboldened by their former commander, that the police would start harassing people, or that even that extremist Buddhist mobs would go on a rampage. And there were some instances of mobs attacking voters on election day, but thankfully that's quite limited. And I think I'm sharing this because I think it's important to understand why does a population, a citizen of a country, fear their state this much? Why is that they're so scared of the state, of the army, which should technically be their army, and the police, which should be their police? And it's because Tamil people's experiences with the state and the majority population have just been so negative for decades, since independence. And I don't want to go into kind of the details of these number of state sponsors excesses against the Tamil people over since independence, and thousands of people died in riots way before the war even started. But if you look at just 2009 and the way the war ended, we're talking about people who were heavily involved. The current president is alleged to have ordered the current Sri Lankan army chief and the current Sri Lankan defense secretary to commit horrific war crimes. And just one example, I'm not going to go into kind of the horrific details. There's so much evidence out there. videos and documentation and good documentaries that you can look up. But just one example to kind of demonstrate the callousness of it is the 12-year-old son of the Tamil leader, who was captured on the last day, on May 18, when the war ended. He was captured on that day, and he was seen in photos in army custody with soldiers in uniform, and they'd given him a snack, and he was eating the snack. And the next photo, the other photo that we have of him is him dead with 5 bullet holes, I think, in his chest. Some independent experts did some analysis of the pictures, and they found that it was, the muzzle signs are still on there. It was close, that the shots were fired within a foot of him. This was an execution, and it is thought this was the current Defense Secretary's unit that was in the area at the time. They knew who this child was, this 12-year-old. They knew that he was a Sami. He had his bodyguards, right? So, did he did himself, he knew, or was he not in touch with the commander at the time, who was now the army chief, or was he not in touch with his defense secretary, who is now the president? So this is just the very real, visceral fear or the distaste that these people live in, especially for Tamil people, when we know they did this. And then this is where, I guess on US engagement, on when Shavendra Silva, the army chief now, and then he was a general, I believe, or brigadier. The US embassy, when he was appointed in just this August, before the election, they said, this appointment undermines Sri Lanka's international reputation and its commitments to promote justice and accountability, especially at a time when the need for reconciliation and social unity is paramount. And then in October, again before the election, at a congressional hearing, Assistant Secretary Wells said, the allegations of gross human rights violations against him, documented by the United Nations and other organizations, are serious and credible. The appointment undermines Sri Lanka's international reputation and its commitments to promote justice and accountability, especially at a time when the need for reconciliation and social unity remain paramount. And at the same hearing, Assistant Secretary Destro said, we have made it clear to the Sri Lankan president and other senior officials that Silva's promotion to army commander will significantly curtail bilateral cooperation with the Sri Lankan army under US law, while accountability for Silva and other perpetrators could lead to easing restrictions and greater military engagement. And this was all before the elections. So this time when this recent visit was announced, we were actually hoping for a recommitment of these values, of the US values, commitment to human rights and justice, and the Geneva Resolution. The US was a key driver behind the efforts for justice at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And even when the US decided to withdraw from the Human Rights Council, Ambassador Kishap at the time, because the Sri Lankans were celebrating, they said, oh wow, the US has left, so the resolution doesn't mean anything anymore to us. Ambassador Kishap came out quite strongly and said, no, actually, we are still watching this, and we still want you to fulfill your commitments to this. And our engagement will be based on those commitments. So we asked for a reiteration of that, of something that it should be part and parcel of things. It's nothing controversial. This is something that Sri Lanka has agreed to, and specifically highlighting certain things. I feel like we've come to we've just been so afraid of challenging Sri Lanka on some of these things in case there's a backlash, that we don't even speak about what's in the resolution anymore. It's just kind of couched under reconciliation, right? But the resolution specifically says establish an independent judicial mechanism with foreign participation, which is something the Sri Lankan government undersigned and the US undersigned. So again, we expected some sort of, we requested some sort of a reiteration of that. Instead, we just, in public, we just saw a few tweets and a statement by the Assistant Secretary Wells last Friday, which again didn't really address those issues. And I think too many in DC seem to be of the opinion that Sri Lanka kind of needs to be given another opportunity, or needs to be given some time to reform. But let me be absolutely clear, Sri Lanka is not going to implement these reforms without international outside pressure. The softly approach that was taken in the past, over the past 6 years, I would say, not only by the international community, but also Western-based NGOs and others. It undermined the possible progress. Progress was really possible, and we do appreciate what the openings that have happened. But Sri Lanka was able to get away with too much in those 5 years. And this started under the previous administration. And it was Ambassador Samantha Power in 2016. It hadn't even been 2 years since the killings, the abductions and the White Line Operation stopped. And she said Sri Lanka was a global champion of human rights. Right? So it was kind of signal to Sri Lanka that actually you're fine. Yeah, do some things, and we first and foremost we have a positive relationship, and then these things come afterward. And this ignored, and when we speak about Sri Lanka, we speak about the state, but we're not speaking about the people of the country. And I think it's important that we also think about the people of the country when we're engaging with the government itself. And yes, the majority of the people of the country voted in this government, but 80% of Tamil people didn't, right? And that's an important constituency in a country where a war was fought on these lines. And I think this is kind of the crux of the matter. How much have we learned from the last 5 years and the failures of the last 5 years? And what does the US want from its relationship with Sri Lanka? I assume we can have a common line. We all want to see a peaceful, stable, and reconciled island. And rather than kind of thinking of things more short term, but what do we need to do now in order to see that in 10 years? It's not going to happen overnight, but some of the measures that can be taken now have to be taken quite strongly. And I'm afraid under this government, we used to say Sri Lanka is not even on the right track, let alone in the right direction, but this government has just completely derailed everything, right? There's no trade. So already Tamil journalists are being harassed, our colleagues. One of our colleagues has been told, he's a lawyer who's an academic at the University of Jaffna, and he's also a human rights activist who worked with our partners in Jaffna, and he's also a practicing lawyer. He does land cases against the military, and cases of the disappeared. A Gazette notification was issued by the government banning law academics from practicing law. Right, this was purely targeted at him. And it's like they were waiting for it. The military immediately sent a letter to the university saying, hey, this guy, he shouldn't practice, or he shouldn't teach. Choose one. And he's now fired. So and this started under the previous government, by the way. But this government is, of course, pushing it further and further. So some of our colleagues in the East have started receiving death threats, and they're journalists, and they've, over the last 5 years, a lot of people, we had this relative period of openness after the 2015 election, but that also wasn't new. We had that same kind of period of hopefulness after the ceasefire in 2001, when for 3-4 years people put their heads above the parapets and were very vocal and very protesting and demonstrating and asking for things, and journalists were reporting freely. As the ceasefire broke down, these people were taken out one by one. Over 1,000 people, I think, one report says, died. Activists and journalists died, just all political activists, I should say, in the period between the end of the war and that, just in the northern province. So I think whenever I was in Jaffna and I was speaking in public, the journalists would make a joke. They would say like, oh yeah, we did this once before, next time you won't be able to come and we were there. So it was always a question of when the deterioration would come. And yeah, we can see that now. The death threats have happened, no condemnation from the government, no investigation as far as we know. And it's up to outside organizations like, our organization or RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières, who've raised this issue and said Tamil journalists are being targeted again. And the random visits by security forces to NGOs, to people who have, who have an activist background, have started, and they've been going on frequently now for the last since the election. Several of the people that we work with have left the country. Some just before the election, and others after, just because it was getting too dangerous to operate. And yeah, Tamils. The thing is, the people still protest. right? The people are still out there and they're still asking for their rights and they're still doing these things. And I fear that the most vulnerable are the ones who are doing most of that sort of work. And especially I wanted to raise it, and I think we will see a return to those really bad days fairly quickly unless a strong message is sent. And I think this is where I think the US government plays an important role, and also publicly state this is not acceptable, this is not, we will not, we will draw the line somewhere here, right? And I think it should be, with the appointment with those military commanders, it's just, it's just incredible that the US military or would have worked with those guys. And now I wanted to, before I end, just bring attention to the families of the disappeared. So the Tamil families have been protesting for over 1,000 days on the streets, and I was there when it first started in 2017. And these mostly women, grandmothers, siblings, spouses of people who were taken into custody by the state. They've been protesting for so many years now, and many of them have witnessed. So as they were, the way the war ended, as people were surrendering into army custody, mothers would hand their sons over, right? The wives would hand their husbands over. Or entire families would be taken. I know one family where the parents and the 7-year-old and the 2-year-old were taken, right? So the grandmother is holding a picture of the whole family, and she's in Kinoji on the street protesting, asking for help. And none of them have had answers so far. And the president, he recently flippantly declared, I think this got quite wide coverage, including in the New York Times. He declared that they were all dead. And you can imagine what then when people see kind of a positive relationship being pursued by government, by the US and others, how painful that is for Tamil Americans, but also how is that actually being helpful to getting answers for these things. And I wasn't going to raise this, I didn't, sometimes there are some people who come here who come from the embassy or other things, it seems. But I went to visit some family, and I don't usually visit family when I'm in Sri Lanka because of the safety concerns. And I'm not really that close to lots of family there, but I'm not really that close to them. This time my mom's uncle had passed away, so she asked me to visit the family. And they had heard that I do this, I do human rights work. And as soon as I went there, mom's cousin came with a bag, and if you've ever visited the families, you know they have a bag with all the documents and the pictures of the missing family members. So she showed me pictures. She said, "This is your cousin. He was taken in May 2009, and we heard you do this work. Can you help us?" And this is an ICRC letter. She's been to all the commissions, and in this case, the government actually, the local court, the Vavuniya court, actually said that they had him in custody. They said, "We have him, we're going to release him, come to this camp, come to that camp." So it's not like the others where they completely denied having anything to do with it. And she went to the commissions under the Rajapaksa's, and I went after the election, and they were not very hopeful about the OMP, but they thought at least it's something, right? But I went after the election, they were like, "Well, this is, I guess we'll never find out," right? And it's just kind of putting yourself into that perspective and just thinking about what that is in 11 years, right? They've been searching up the country up, and they've gone to prisons in the south to search for it. To just have that about your child, and I mean, I knew this was happening, I just didn't know it was so close, it was happening in my family. But yeah, I just wanted to close with that, just to share that this is, it can't, I understand US interests are wide and varied, but we have to do better. I think we have to be better than others at these sort of things, and I think Sri Lanka is a good example of where we can actually set an example.
Thank you. I want to open it up for, how much time do we have, Laura?
20 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to throw out a couple of questions, but then we'll open it up for some questions from the audience if you folks have any. Just out of curiosity, what was the Tamil turnout during the last election?
High. I think the
High.
highest in the country, yeah.
Do we have any idea what percentage of them? Now, was Sirisena running for re-election?
No, it was
Who was the opponent?
Sajid Premadasa. I mean, if you know him, he's a good cool guy, but he didn't really have the support of his party. But he, I think, turnout in the Tamil areas was 70% close to, and 80% voted for him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you just answered my question. What percentage of the Tamils voted for the opponent?
It was up to 80%, I think. At least in the northern province, in the eastern province, it was also in the high 70s.
Okay, all right. And then more of a question, more of a statement than a question. You know, the one factor that we don't control is the voice, and well, there's a lot we don't control, but one for certain is the voice of the Sri Lankan people. And they've now placed this Rajapaksa brother regime in power. And so the United States and the rest of the world, the international community, is going to have to figure out how to work with them. And it's going to be a learning process. But we cannot relent in our demands for transitional justice, and that they account for the missing and stand true to the commitments that the government has made to bring human rights and equality to all Sri Lankans. How we do that is going to be vitally important. I probably don't have to tell anybody in this room. You mentioned it, Dr. Bew, that's prime real estate. One of the things that makes it prime real estate is because of the influence of the Chinese. China is expanding militarily, politically, internationally, on the global economy. China is marching. And Sri Lanka, the southern tip of the island, sits very, very close to the sea lines of communication, where a bulk of the world's commerce and trade flow through. Not to mention the massive deep water port that has been built there in Colombo. You can see it from just outside the windows of the political leaders' offices. So we've got a tenuous situation to deal with the newly elected administration that has disavowed any intention to pursue the transitional justice reforms that the government had previously committed to. So we're walking a tightrope here, because the last thing we want is for the Rajapaksa regime to go entirely over and embrace China. That would not be good for the world. It would not be good for the region. How do we? The big question is, how do we demand and exact reforms, and at the same time not cross over that line where we push them right into the waiting arms of the Chinese? Because the Chinese don't care about these transitional justice reforms and reconciliation commitments. They could care less. So that's the big question. Let me open it up to the rest of the audience. I've got to run back to my office. I'm going to leave Laura here, but please continue to ask your question, and I think I'll be seeing some of you in a bit. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Go ahead. Let's open it up for questions from the audience.
Hi, Will Ferrajaro with Strategy for Humanity, a human rights consultancy. I guess my question, you highlighted, Dr. Bew, some potential aspects of anti-Americanism. Is my question relates to general leverage of outside actors, and so I wondered if you could speak. Congressman laid out some interests of the U.S., but I wonder actually about the actual impact of U.S. leverage, and then if both of you could also speak to the UN's leverage and the different mechanisms that are active in the island, as well as globally, as well as any potential regional actors. Thank you.
the prior administration with Sirisena and Wickremesinghe, I think that the U.S. had more leverage in that it had an administration that was more like-minded, that really wanted to focus on good governance, wanted to look at transitional justice issues, signed up for that plan in Geneva. And they wanted to steer away from China a little bit. I mean, the feeling had been that the Rajapaksas had gone all in on China, in part because they had nowhere else to go at that point, but they were all for it. It was easy money, or, you know, so to speak, for projects that they felt they needed. So there were a lot of reasons to believe that the Sri Lankans wanted to work with us under the prior government. Under this government, however, it's yet to be seen how much leverage we have. I think that's something that I'm sure the State Department and Defense Department and White House are assessing in terms of what leverage we have at all. The Rajapaksas have a long memory in terms of U.S. involvement, and they do feel that China was a better friend to them during the times that they were in office. So I think it's yet to be seen what the U.S. Can and will do in terms of its other strategic interests.
Yeah, just to add to that, the US was a huge partner of Sri Lanka during the war. The US government supported and through various ways Rajapaksas war against the Tamil Tigers. And it was only in the beginning of 2009, I think that was when President Obama came out into the White House alone and says, this is getting a bit out of hand, this needs to stop. And you're right, it was not just the US, but also the EU and other like-minded countries who withdrew from engaging with a country that's so horrible. And some may argue that was the wrong move because it allowed China to go in. And yeah, so for Sri Lanka, they didn't have anywhere else to go, they had to go to China. But fast forward to 2015, that contributed to the election of the new government. Sri Lankans, as a people, whether they're Tamil or Sinhalese, are not pro-Chinese. They don't want to send their children to Beijing University, right? They want to, send them to Oxford or to Harvard, or it's a society geared towards Western culture, right? And it was becoming difficult for the Rajapaksas to also, that was also an argument, right? As in, we're isolated around the world, and is treating us as this bad actor. We've had enough of these people, and they couldn't sustain it economically either, this Chinese engagement. So yeah, I know people would disagree, but I'd say, good luck, go with China, and we see what happens. How long can you sustain this? The economy is in dire straits, the Sri Lankan economy. And I think the Rajapaksas know that. That they cannot rely on China the way they used to. And I think that presents some leverage. I think that they would not want to return to those days and hold it that over the head to say, we are going to raise justice, we are going to raise accountability, and if not, you'll be back in the bad books, or you will be in the bad books until you fix that. Would actually spur reforms. I just feel like this approach of trying to contract what China does, and for some reason when we speak about China and Sri Lanka, we completely ignore the big countries sitting on top of Sri Lanka. Because Indians are watching too. The Indians seem to be, reaffirming their presence in the region, right?
Sorry, but just going back to the Rajapaksas and why they were elected. In 2015 they lost, not just because people were tired of China's influence, but the government was corrupt. They were increasingly authoritarian in how they would rule Sri Lanka. There was great concern about institutions within Sri Lanka, within the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, but also the public became concerned that the Rajapaksas were leading them in an anti-democratic direction, and so therefore that opened the door for Sirisena and then Wickremesinghe. What can't be underestimated in this last election, however, which brought the Rajapaksas back, was the Easter bombings. Security was a gigantic issue in this election, and the Rajapaksas made a lot out of it in order to boost Gotabaya's run. So I think looking forward, let's see how they're able to increase security and whether they are able to make those promises, because the reasons they were voted out have every opportunity to come back. I mean, whether it's good governance, whether it's financial misdealings, corruption, any of the rest, authoritarian rule, that still is fertile ground against them. So again, we have to see how far the security mandate plays out if they don't correct the other reasons why they were voted out in the first place in 2015. I'm sorry.
That's fair. Yeah, I mean, it played into the whole thing with the corruption and everything. And I think also the fact, I mean, if you're relying on China to prop up your economy, then the economic state and people being unhappy, you know, the Rajapaksa's also had to crack down, and I think that's what the expectation is now. Also that there's a huge deficit, and you know they're giving subsidies and they're cutting taxes, and you know they're giving out all these boons because an election is coming up. It's not sustainable, and the honeymoon will end right at some point. And you know, I just don't see how is it actually going to be again, you know, China to the rescue. I think India's reaction to the election was interesting. India's re-establishment of direct transport links between Tamil Nadu in South India and Jaffna in the northeast is also interesting, and I think India's also making its mark on Sri Lanka. So, I mean, but yeah, it remains to be seen. I think the next election will be, which should be coming in a few months, will be more indicative of what we to expect.
Can you speak a little bit about the UN, their leverage?
Yeah.
Issues of sovereignty and
Sri Lanka signed up to the resolution. They co-sponsored it. It wasn't the UNP government, it wasn't this politician, it was Sri Lanka as a country. And with that, you know, there are commitments that were made. But, you know, with the Human Rights Council and the state, it's in, yeah, it's not very strong, but I think from the Tamil perspective, it's a path, it's an outlet. So I think, you know, people will be very keen to keep Sri Lanka on the agenda there. And it depends on what, I mean, Rajapaksa has already said. He said it once and then he went fairly quiet on it that he will withdraw from the UN Human Rights Council. If they've learned anything from the past 5 years, they would just say, yeah, okay, not do anything, because that you know, served the previous government quite well. But I don't know, it's still going by Rajapaksa, and I don't know if you've seen his interviews, but he's unhinged in some ways, right? So with an election coming up, I also wouldn't be surprised if he just goes, you know, let's do this, we don't want to be part of this anymore. But again, I mean, it's coming up in March, so it will be interesting to see the reactions, and if there is sufficient pressure from the monks, from the Buddhist Sangha and others, then they may just pull out. Leverage is limited, because I don't think even, so if I mean, the resolution is there, it's not going away just because they pull out. It doesn't really mean anything, but is there appetite for another resolution on Sri Lanka? Would there be something passed next year? That's what the question would be. And I think this is where leadership of countries, like-minded countries, is important. And leverages exist. The EU decided to give Sri Lanka GSP Plus trade concessions on mere pledges that the PTA would be repealed, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. In our advocacy, we were saying they would not wait until they do it and then repeal it. What's the rush? I know they repealed it now, they've lost that lever, and I think, you know, those are levers that exist. So I wouldn't say that they are none, but they are quite limited.
Hi. So we are expecting the parliamentary elections soon. Now there's a expectation of fear among the capital community that the Rajapaksas are waiting to get the supermajority in parliament, two-thirds majority, that's the point, where they will then consolidate power by even making an amendment to the constitution. Get it up, I believe the 19th amendment can get up. What is your view of that, and you think I think it's almost certain we are going to get a majority, if not a two-thirds majority.
So what happened after the election if you remember the inauguration ceremony, it took place in Anuradhapura, which is the old Sinhalese capital. And he held his inaugurative speech in front of a statue to a Sinhalese king who had vanquished a Tamil king and created the Raja of the entire island was under Sinhalese control at that time. And he said something along the lines of, I don't need the Tamil word to win. He won entirely on the Sinhalese world. Right? And I think that emboldened him along that he was able to do that. And because usually when the opposition party is a bit stronger, then Sinhalese vote will be split somewhat, even if not equally. But this time he was just so strong in the south. Whether he will be able to do that again, his party will do that again in the parliamentary elections, I don't know. I heard they may not have the numbers yet, but it also depends on the coalitions that they form and the corruption. The ministers in Sri Lanka switch sides like anything. So I think they might just do it. And I agree. I think they will act very quickly to kind of undo some of those important changes that were done under the previous government.
I think ideally the Rajapaksa's aren't in favor of a lot of what happened under the 19th Amendment, but it's anyone's guess as to whether they'll be in a position to make those kinds of changes. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, no, I think it's the crux of the problem in Sri Lanka is the political kind of tension between the Tamil community and the Sinhalese community, where since the 1972 constitution, the Tamils rejected that constitution, but that's a constitution that's now in place. And I know some of you have heard of this already, but Article 2 in the constitution says it's the state's role. Buddhism has a first and foremost place, and it's the state's role to protect and foster Buddhism. Right, and that's why Tamils rejected, because it puts minorities at a disadvantage, religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And so for the Tamil political question, where Tamils are pushing for devolution, for federalism, quite reasonable demands in any democracy. Without a two-thirds majority, it's just nigh impossible. So it's also a very crucial time for the Tamil National Alliance, for the Tamil Party, to figure out what's going to happen. Are they going to lower the expectations now, or are they going to stick to we want a federal solution in a merged northeast? That all we'll see when the elections come up. But whenever it's election time in Sri Lanka, all bars are loose, and there are no holds barred. So we'll see how the Tamils and party also reacts to that. That will also be interesting to watch.
We have time for one last question.
One of the devastating news recently, the 20,000 dead news from the president, and the mothers and grandmothers, they have been protesting for more than 1,000 days, and I'm being in touch with them, and how are they taking it?
Badly. I mean, there was a protest outside. I think, I don't know, I really feel for them, because I think it's also like, what do you do now? Right? You lash out at the thing, so there was some hope in the OMP. So the first thing they did last week is they went and, this is the Office of Missing Persons that was established by the previous government, which is now, basically a shell. And they went and protested outside that, saying, we trust you, we put some faith in you, and look, what now? But they rejected it, so I saw some messages earlier today from them, and when they did a press conference, and they said, we completely reject this. We will not accept the death certificates unless we know what happened to them. If they're dead, fine. Tell us how did they die? Who killed them? Right. So I don't know. It's just heartbreaking to that whole. It's like a community, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of them.
Having visited several of them in Sri Lanka, it's hard to believe that they would ever give up, given how much emotion they have for their family, some of whom they actually turned over themselves, so there's a lot of guilt there. But if you recall, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe had equally harsh comments made several years ago, and I think that fueled this effort, and it may just be that these remarks give them additional fuel to continue protesting.
So, did you?
Okay, So, would you say that your main legislative priority would be for the U.S. to coerce the current government to reaffirm their commitment to the resolution? Like, would that be the main legislative priority? And then also, can you think of any other means of intervention that could be implemented, not necessarily just by the U.S., but like by the EU or the UN, to curtail the current tensions between the Sinhalese and Tamil people?
I mean, coerce is a strong word, but I like it. I don't mind. But I think, always this example of the IMF. I've said this to some of you before. When we want economic reforms, the IMF goes in and implements these harsh measures, and there are riots, and there are farmers up and things. But it's okay because it's for the long term and it's seen as a positive for the economy. And I think when it comes to people's lives, when it comes to preventing, and this is about preventing reoccurrence, right? That's where the fear stems from. I don't think a strong hand is something that's necessarily a bad thing. I just, but then also countries involved also must lead by example, and I think that's really important. Legislative priority, I think the restrictions that exist on the military relationship are good, and thank God they exist. I think it depends how you want to approach it. I think the previous kind of view that the US will engage with Sri Lanka on the basis of the Human Rights Council resolution, as long as it's actually on the resolution, so there shouldn't be any fear of we can't say this, we can't say justice, we can't say judicial mechanism, we can't. So if it's strongly about that, then we should base our relationship on that, I think. And we're not saying cut off all relationship with Sri Lanka. We're saying no, the relationship is important, but have it on some principle. But I'm not sure. People here can speak more to as to what the possibilities also are in Congress in passing some legislation. Or I think the Appropriations Act already pretty much limits a lot of what could go to Sri Lanka, and it's based on some very strong conditions, such as answering to the families of the disappeared specifically. So we'd like to see maintenance of that kind of engagement. But under the previous government, I think before Silva was appointed, our main issue was kind of the military engagement, because the military that committed these crimes is also, so there are 240,000 soldiers in the Sri Lankan military, and 200,000 in the army alone, and the army is split across 5 divisions, 5 regional commands. This is one of the largest armies. It's bigger than the Israeli army, it's bigger than the British army, and for a country of 20 million, and 7 regional commands, and 5 out of the 7 commands are based in the Tamil area. So it's a heavily disproportionate presence, right? This was actually one of the early asks for security sector reform, in a way that the military can move out from some of a more proportionate presence in those places. How the US can ask for those things, I think engagement should be conditioned on those things, and I honestly think the Sri Lankans know to play the China card really well. I mean, I've heard this one who says this in meetings, like, oh, we'll go to China if you don't do this. Right? As in they have that, they're not afraid to use that also to their advantage. And I think we should call it bluff. But yeah, it's just
Jan 20, announced 20,000 people that day. Those people handed over family members. So is there any evidence how they did, how he said they can give death certificate?
yeah.
So what was the cause of the death? How they did? Is there any answer?
I think the US should ask him, right? As in the engagement would be okay. So you said they're dead, and I was, a few years ago, I think there would have been a statement from the US on things like this, right, from the embassy. These days, I mean, the Sri Lankans are doing a lot of things, like harassment of journalists and other things, where there just isn't the same, even reactiveness. I would say we should be more proactive, but on Memorial Days, Ambassador Kishap used to, you know, attend disappeared events. I saw Ambassador Assistant Secretary Alice Wells actually went to a disappeared event in 2017. It just seems incredible if they would never do that now, right? They just seem to be so shying away. So I think, you know, it's a good question, and people more powerful than us should also ask the government that.
Thank you, everybody, for your comments.